It's the final weekend of the month. You know what that means. It's style study time. And today we are doing something really cute and really adorable because today we are diving into the incredible illustrations of Sara Faber. If any of you guys are into that super cutesy children's illustration-y work, this is the video for you. It's strange recording in the daylight. I hope the lighting is good. But today's video was requested by Coffee's Club 5457. So thank you so much for requesting this video. And I'm sorry it's taken so long to come around to it, but I do hope you enjoy it and that it's everything you were hoping for. Now, if you're new to my channel and this is your very first style study, hi, welcome. My name is Srish and I'm so glad you're here because today we're gonna level up your art by like 1,000,000%. Style study is a regular series I like to do here on my channel where we take a look at some of our favorite contemporary artists, analyze their work and see what we can learn from it. Keyword, learn. We're not here to plagiarize anyone's work or copy their style. We're simply here to learn some really cool art tips and tricks and see how we can apply it to finding our own unique art style. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll take a look at Sara's work, analyze her style and see what we can learn from it. Part 2 will be a study of one of her original paintings. The adorable reference I've chosen today is this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. Sort of. It is some fan art, but there was a little bit of drum. I'll explain it. If you enjoyed this video and learned something today, please remember to like and subscribe. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study and come say hello on socials. All my links are in the video description. And now, if you're ready, grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into another style study featuring Sara Faber. Sara Faber is an illustrator and comic artist based in Berlin, Germany. She specializes in bright, punchy character illustrations, the kind you would see in preteen and teen comics. In fact, her young readers comic project, The League of Littles, that she worked on with author Casey Lyle, was just nominated for a Silver Birch Express Award by the Canadian Forest of Reading program. Sara's art is adorable, expressive, and packed full of personality. Although there is a distinct style across all of her work, no two characters look alike, and I especially love that the characters have such loud, visibly animated faces. Sara's beautiful work has garnered her over 631,000 followers on Instagram and over 189,000 subscribers here on YouTube. I think my favorite part of Sara's work is how wholesome it all is, while also being really dynamic. I love the diversity across the characters, but also the diversity of genres across her work. You see these adorable preteens doing childhood things. Then you have something like the Sabrina Carpenter piece, which is grown up and suggestive, but still very wholesome. Sometimes there's a demon that is still absolutely wholesome. And then you have fan art of Wednesday from a show that is arguably not child friendly. She still looks adorable, but you see she does have an edge. It's such a fine line to walk, creating sweet, adorable art while still maintaining a sense of dynamism. And I really feel like it goes to show us just how much of an expert Sara is. Like the fact that these illustrations are clearly made with a young audience in mind, but they still appeal to grown-ups all the same, that's actually really hard to achieve. And as you know, the idea of diversity has been on my mind a lot, and it makes me so happy that Sara's characters have a wide variety of skin tones and hair colors and textures. I love that her art is multiculturalist. Speaking of lists, here are 4 key characteristics to Sara's art. To me, the most important thing about Sara's style is the simplicity of the lighting setup she uses. The vast majority of her character portraits are painted in a bright, diffused white light setting. How can you tell? Because everything is true to color. Here, for instance, the skin is all the same tone, the hair is the same tone, the hat, dress, basket, and flowers are all the same tone. Not as each other, but like there is uniformity within each element. It's not like the shadows are a whole different hue than the midtones or highlights, they're just a darker value. Same here, where the background isn't just a flat white color. You can see that the character is very brightly lit, and again that there aren't very dramatic hue shifts caused by the lighting. Everything is uniformly colored, and everything is the color you expect it to be under bright white light. The lack of crazy color shifts tells us that the light source is full spectrum white, and the lack of dramatic form shadows tells us that the light source is large and diffused. Just a little tip to help you determine the light source when you come across references moving forward. However, let's look at a painting like this one. Now the light is warm and directional because it's casting harsh, cold occlusion shadows on the background elements. However, see how the character is still very brightly illuminated? Sure, the tones are warmer, but if you look at how dark the back of the seat is behind her because it faces away from the light, the entire character should be that dark because she is also facing away from the light source. However, there is a very important reason why Sara chose not to paint that dark shadow on the character, and is my absolute favorite word when it comes to composition. It is to enhance the readability of the piece. Now, if you've been on this channel for a couple of months, you know that we saw this in the Gret Lusky style study. The readability of a painting is about how easily you can tell what's going on in the scene at a quick glance. Like here, one look tells you that this is a young girl wearing a school uniform carrying a backpack. This is very high readability. Here, where it's a lot darker, you would assume the readability would reduce significantly, but one glance and you can tell that this is a girl in a jumper hanging out on a balcony in a busy city. Despite there not being a very bright, diffused light source, Sara still incorporates very high readability in her work. How? By painting large, flat-colored shapes in the face, hair, and clothing, and also in the background where it is in focus. However, in a painting like this, where the background is more complex and there's a lot going on that would distract you and lower the readability, she simply hits it with a blur. This makes the background so out of focus that you're automatically drawn to the character, the only part of the scene that does have hard edges. I've said this on style studies before and I'll say it again, readability is the most important aspect in children's illustrations because kids have tiny attention spans. In order to tell them a story, you need the story to be clear, visible, and understandable at a single glance. And that is exactly what Sara does in every one of her illustrations. Here's the thing about high readability though. Sometimes it can make the piece feel very static. In order to combat that, Sara uses an incredible trick that most of us forget to consciously incorporate into our work: a dynamic silhouette. You see, because these characters are generally very soft and rounded, what can happen is that everything looks a little too simplistic and mellow. And when something is that chilled out, your viewer's eyes might just glide across the piece once and then move on. As always, our goal as artists is to keep the viewer's attention for as long as possible, and the way to do it is to involve edges. Here is my favorite analogy to explain this idea. You know when you wear socks on a hardwood floor? The socks have a soft surface, the hardwood floor is super smooth. What happens? You glide right across it really quickly. On the other hand, think of Velcro. It has all these jagged little shapes and tiny hooks that make it so rough to the touch. But it is arguably one of the most grippiest materials on the planet. So a painting with only round shapes and smooth silhouettes is like socks on a hardwood floor. Your eyes slide right past it. But involving interesting shape language gives your painting that Velcro quality. Let's look at this fan art of Jinx. Her head is round, so is her hair at the crown. But do you see how with that braid, there are so many tiny little angles that break up what would otherwise be a smooth curve? Even on the other side, that arm could have been one long line, but Sarah's broken it up with the little armbands, the fingers, and the folds on that sleeve. Here, this character has long, flowy hair, and Sara likely didn't want to create any jagged edges to make it look unkempt. Instead, she opted for a couple of stray locks here and there that still follow the general direction of the hair, but they just bump out a little. Just enough to break up that silhouette, but without causing too much interruption. Which brings me to the next detail that creates more interest in the silhouette: negative shapes. A negative shape is the shape created by the absence of an object, and this is something I personally struggle with consciously incorporating into my own art. I'm telling you guys, the Style Study series is as much for me as it is for you. But here, for instance, we have two characters, and there's actually two separate kinds of negative space going on. First, you have this gap between their faces where there is nothing at all. It's also visible here where her hair meets her shoulder. It's a very interesting shape. The second kind is actually within the characters, and it's this area between the arms of the first character. Because the purple character is painted with a much darker value, and the background is fairly dark and purple as well, it kind of gives you a secondary, more subtle but still impactful negative space. Here you have lots of negative space, not just in the character's silhouette, but also with these plants against that flat background. These add to that Velcro stickiness. You're never going to forget that analogy now, are you? But yes, interesting silhouettes are a key feature in Sara's work. They add much needed movement and grit to what would otherwise be very gentle, visually quiet paintings. Alright, I know this is what you're here for, is how you go about painting those super cute proportions and adorable characters. Believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of nuance to really nailing the cuteness here. Let's start with the face, which is arguably the most important aspect. So obviously everything is very rounded, very soft. The overall structure of the face itself is very broad, with a soft, rounded jaw that narrows into a round chin. However, I also want to mention that the jaw isn't very tall. It's actually a small vertical distance between the start of that narrowing, the angle of the mandible, if you will, and the chin. Keep this in mind for the moment, we'll come back to it. The eyes are obviously very, very large and lie at about the halfway point of the head. Sara does this thing where she'll paint the eyes to be a large, flat, white shape with rounded inner and outer corners. The iris is usually a flat black circle or oval with a little white spot for a specular highlight. And pretty much every eye is lined with a black lash line on top, and the bottom edge is either left white or there's a very subtle little underline that's barely visible. What I also found interesting is that the eyebrow is often even visible through the hair. This is because the eyebrows actually hold a lot of information about the character's expression. Let's look at this piece, for instance. The character is smiling, maybe a little cheekily, but say now I change the shape of the eyebrow to be more flat. See how now she looks almost suspicious? The eyebrows play a huge role in the expression of the character's face, and so Sara makes very sure that they are always super visible. The nose is generally quite minimal in terms of the line art. You'll just see some little dashes to show the nostrils and maybe a slight curve to indicate the nose bulb. Most of the dimension, however, comes from a little flat oval shadow that goes from the lower half of the nose bulb to just under the nostrils. It is very slightly darker than the color of the skin, but it gives us a sense of form because it encompasses both the form shadow due to the roundness of the nose bulb and also the drop shadow caused by it. Now, remember when I said the jaw isn't very tall at all? That makes it so that Sara paints the mouth very, very low on the head. Like, it's usually just barely above the chin, and because she paints these pouty, rounded lips, it kind of makes the mouth look like it's even lower down on the head. In my opinion, this is what really pushes that baby face look. Generally, we get that look when the eyes are extremely low on the head, but here Sara keeps them at about the half point of the head, as you would see in an adult face. However, because 1, the eyes take up so much vertical space, 2, the jaw is so short, and 3, the nose and mouth are pushed so far down, it gives us that baby face proportion in the lower half of the face. As a result, these faces look both grown-up and childlike at the same time. The characters' bodies are fairly simplified. They don't generally have very dramatic curves or extreme musculature at all. In fact, the limbs are generally quite straight with maybe a gentle curve to indicate elbows and knees. The neck is usually quite narrow, as are the shoulders, at least in relation to the larger head. Again, pushes that baby face look. So it's not the actual proportions that cause the dramatic silhouettes and negative space that we saw earlier, it's how Sara positions the characters' bodies, clothing and hair. It's like these characters are inherently quite gentle and soft and calm, but the way that they move through the world is what creates all that dimension and drama. That's some masterful storytelling. We looked at the analogy of socks on a wooden floor versus Velcro, but here's an aspect of Sara's art that actually kind of works like Velcro on a wooden floor. She draws on a lot of texture on top of smooth rendering. Let's start with the skin, for instance. If you look at it zoomed in, you realize that the base of the skin is a very flat mid-tone, and any indication of form is usually airbrushed onto it. So the reddened shadow in the cheek and nose, the slight brightness of the forehead and jaw, it's all very blurry and the edges blend gradually into the mid-tone. The first really visible layer on top of that is the flat shadow. She basically grabs a tone that is just slightly darker than the base tone and creates these flat, hard-edged shadows around the perimeter of the face. It's usually the same color as the flat shadow of the nose that we saw earlier, and is generally the only detail that makes the face look rounded around the sides rather than completely flat. Then there's the additional layer that really adds a lot of texture, that is the line work. Now, unlike most modern digital comic art, the lines in Sara's work are actually quite traditional looking in that they look grainy and textured rather than smooth and uniform. The little bit of graininess creates some much needed small shapes which balance out the flat, large and medium shapes in the rendering, adding that final polish to the skin. Plus, that graininess kind of looks like it's been drawn with crayon, which again appeals to that children's illustration look and feel. And if you look at the rest of the piece, she actually treats every other element of the character, the hair, the clothing, in the same way. You have a base tone, airbrushed highlights and hue shifts, plus a flat shadow tone, and then the grainy liner to add a bit of movement and texture. The hair has one extra element in the form of a glossy highlight at the bumpiest area. This is a common trait among a lot of comic book art to add some shine to the hair that instantly makes it super smooth. Except Sara doesn't go extremely bright with it. It's usually a few tones lighter than the base tone of the hair, but nowhere close to straight up white. That way it creates shine, but isn't like an unrealistically glossy color. And to tie it all up, you'll occasionally see these little floaty accents like stars or floating specks, and it just adds tiny bits of whimsy, especially against a large flat background. As a result, the overall piece looks well-rounded and balanced, and with equal amounts of large, quiet shapes and small, noisy ones that keep your eyes darting across the canvas while maintaining your attention for as long as possible. So, to sum up part 1 of this study, here are 4 key characteristics to Sara Faber's art. Number 1, the light source is generally a large, diffused white light that illuminates the characters evenly and makes the colors appear true to life. This creates very high readability, which is very important for children's illustrations. 2, Sara creates these really interesting silhouettes with small shapes to break up large lines, as well as powerful negative shapes. This keeps the composition looking dynamic despite the overall characters being rather mellow. Number 3, the characters' proportions are fairly rounded, making them look really cute and childlike. Nuanced details such as the eyebrows create a lot of very loud expression in the face. And number 4, Sara layers soft blending with hard-edged shadows and grainy line work to create the perfect balance of large, medium, and small shapes that help the composition feel even-keeled and complete. For our study today, this is the adorable reference that I've chosen. It is clearly a still from the Barbie movie, but it truly encompasses everything that we've seen in part 1 of this video, so it felt like it was the perfect piece to learn from. I started, of course, with a sketch. With studies, I actually like to establish a silhouette first. It just helps me do relative sizes a lot better. But with this specific style, it also really helped me drill down into the idea of silhouettes and negative space. Because while on the surface it seems like a lot of her shapes are very rounded and soft, the intersections between, say, the hair and the hat, or the top of her sleeve and the braid, those are actually really sharp angles. So one thing I realized while doing the study is just how important the line weights are in Sara's work. Because see how with messy, thick, sketchy lines, the eyes look so intense, the features are all just so entirely too sharp? It feels like I had the proportions so crazy wrong, but having done enough style studies, I know not to judge the sketch. So I colored it pink, it felt appropriate, lowered the opacity, and got started with the line art. Because the lines are super grainy around the edges, I actually use this one brush preset that I've linked in the description. It's really cool. And what I learned was that this process was super time consuming. I guess part of that is because if you've been on my channel before, you know that I try my best to match every single line of the reference. So hey, let's be real, it probably won't take you as long if you weren't as obsessive as I am. But regardless, it was actually an incredible exercise in using line weights consciously and just getting better at pen pressure control. Also, with things like the nose and mouth, it was a great exercise in doing a lot with a little. Like with the lips, the only visible lines are at the separation of the upper and lower lips, but because of the shape and line weight, the lines themselves actually make the lips look super plump and full. I was definitely making changes as I went along, resizing things, warping them around, but like I mentioned earlier, it wouldn't have made sense to make these changes until I got to the line art stage. Because when I hide the sketch underneath, you can kind of tell there's a massive difference in the look and feel of the shape language. So I think a big lesson for me through this study was that line weight is way more impactful than you would think. The next step was to create a color palette. You know by now that I love doing this. It just creates a handy dandy color strip to color pick from, and I think it's particularly important with a style like this where a lot of the rendering is very flat and low contrast. You can't just approximate the colors and hope that with enough blending they'll sort themselves out. The colors that Sara uses are impactful and chosen very carefully. I made 4 separate color palettes for the skin, hair, clothing, and background in order, and then got to work on the easiest part of the painting, i.e. the background. Here's the great thing about Sara's style. The complex backgrounds are simpler to paint than they appear. All you really need to do is create flat shapes and then hit the whole thing with a Gaussian blur. So, as you can see, I started with the blue of the sky, then painted in that pink mountain in the distance. I then painted the sand behind her, which was, well, a flat sandy color. And finally, I painted the 2 cactus guys, just approximating the shapes. Because all of these are going to be hit with a fairly heavy blur, we don't really need to worry about super clean edges. Because once I hit it with the blur, you can see that it looks quite like the reference. As long as we have a general approximation of the shapes, you'll be fine. It's just such a great technique, honestly. It adds so much sophistication with so little work. Next, I dove into flattening in the different elements on their individual layers. So the skin is all on one flat layer, the hair is another layer, the bow is a third layer, and the dress and hat are a fourth. Oh, and the earrings. For each of these, I grabbed the color that covers the largest parts of the element. So for the skin, it was that mid-tone peachy color. For the hair, it was actually the brighter blonde tone, and so on and so forth. Creating these flats means that I can either lock transparency or create clipping groups, and that way I'm always coloring within the lines. I also painted the whites of the eyes and the upper and lower lips on their own individual layer, and all the shading of the skin can go underneath that layer. We don't want to accidentally color over them. From this point forward, it was actually a really quick and easy process. All I had to do was airbrush some redness at her cheeks and nose and a little bit of brightness at her forehead to give her that hue variation in the face. I then grabbed a flat round brush and a color slightly darker than the base tone and flattened in those shadows around her temples, eyelids, and under her jaw. The eyebrows actually had to go on a layer above her hair because remember, they hold all the expression and so they need to be visible even through her hair. I sized down the mouth a little bit and that's literally all there is to the face. With the hair, I started with those super glossy highlights on the fringe and the braid. God, I love those so much. Then I painted on the dark shadows that have flat edges. Now remember, these are all on their own layers, but the layers are clipped to that flat blonde base that we painted earlier. So we're always painting within the lines, but also non-destructively. If I don't like a shadow shape that I painted, I can just erase it and redo it without affecting either the base or the highlights. There was also a little bit of airbrushed warmth at the top of her fringe and in like the lower half of the braid, so I threw that in. The bow was pretty much just two colors, though I didn't quite get them warm enough, so I did a little hue adjust. Now, her top/dress that she's wearing was the actual tricky bit for me. There's a mix of soft airbrushed bits and some hard-edged shadows and highlights, but it's the tiny little grainy texture that was really confusing. So I first went in and painted the shading as best as I could, though it was definitely tricky. I quickly painted on her earrings, which were essentially made of three colors, two of the shadow tones from the hair and a bright highlight. Very, very simplified, but still gives us the impression of rounded pearls. The hat was a lot simpler to paint than her top because there's no textures confusing my brain. I honestly don't know why that got me. And next I went on top of the liner to paint on these stray strands of super bright hair that break up her silhouette and create these tiny little negative spaces. Finally, I had to just bite the bullet and work some texture into her dress. This was the best one that I could find that kind of mimics the shape of the texture that Sara's used here. What I really struggled with was the blending modes. I think Sara used a texture that was essentially the inverse of the one I used. So like it brightens up what's underneath, but the lines themselves are dark. I don't know if that makes sense, but just know that it was scary and I need a hug. But all in all, I really, really enjoyed this study and oh my gosh, isn't this the cutest painting ever? I'm so in love with how she turned out. Alright, so here's the thing. When I was working on these paintings, I was PMSing hard. And when I'm sad and in pain, my comfort movie is always Pride and Prejudice. The Matthew McFadden hand flex is literally medicine, just trust me. So for the original painting today, I wanted to paint some fan art. Now, I had initially painted Elizabeth, look, here's that painting, and then just I was literally about to script this video, I read how she's in the new Harry Potter series, and that directly funds transphobic policies, so I will absolutely have none of that on my channel. As much as those books were amazing and were integral to so many of our childhoods, if it doesn't encourage inclusivity, and in fact the profits go directly towards bigoted people and their bigoted opinions, and they then use that to try and enforce a bigoted society, I will absolutely have no part in it. So instead, I decided to start all over and painted the gorgeous Rosamund Pike as Jane. That's what you're looking at right now. Rant over, back to the art. As with the study, I started by sketching out a rough base image, then went over the sketch with clean but gritty lines. I then painted super flat shapes for the background before hitting them with a heavy blur. However, based on the reference, I felt like the shapes were a little too smooth and there really wasn't enough detail, so I ended up grabbing my magic brush, which is just a flat round brush with pressure opacity dynamics, and roughly scribbled in some extra little details. Next, I brought the reference back and set off creating a skin tone palette. Now, because this is a photo reference, I actually had to make some decisions here. Human skin is made of lots and lots of colors. You have rosiness and grayness in some areas that are warmer than others, but with Sara's style, the challenge is to really distill all of that into no more than 4 or 5 colors. So I really tried to stick to a base tone, a rosy color for the cheek, and then a little bit of a warmer tone for the flat shadows. Her hair has highlights and a shadow root, so I also tried to capture the entire spectrum of hair color in 4 shades. Oh, wish me luck. I started as always with flat layers, keeping the eyes, lips and brows on their own layers so that the rendering doesn't interfere with them. I created a dusty rose blur around her cheek and nose and actually realized that her overall skin tone looked a little too dark, so I brightened up the forehead and jaw area quite a bit. And also I airbrushed in a super bright secondary light that hits the side of her neck and a little bit of her face. I then painted in those flat shadow areas. I gotta be honest, it was kind of hard to figure out where to place these without losing that soft, flat, low contrast quality of the render. Because of the lighting in this reference, Rosamund's eyes actually look rather sunken in at the inner corners. So I had to kind of work a compromise between being faithful to the reference versus the style. The hair was loads of fun to paint because a lot of it was trying to find a way to create hard-edged and simplified highlights, but without making them look extremely chunky. I ended up airbrushing some of those lighter tones up into that shadow root on the crown of her head, and adding those glossy shapes just really pumped up the look and feel of her hair. You guys, I'm honestly so in love with how this painting looks. I don't know quite how well I nailed the style, but it was definitely way harder to work from an actual photo as a reference. What do you guys think? Do you think I got the style right? And there we have it, Sara Faber demystified. So what was your favorite part of this study? For me, it was definitely the hair. There is something so beautiful about the simplicity of the rendering and that added glossiness. It creates so much dimension without creating too much texture. Really cool. But what part of this style are you going to bring forward into your own work moving forward? Let me know in the comments below. I have, of course, linked all of Sara's work in the video description. Go check her out and show her some love for me. And thank you so much again to Coffee's Club 5057 for requesting this video. I truly hope it's been everything you've been looking for and that it was super helpful. If the rest of you guys have enjoyed this video as well and learned something today, please remember to like and subscribe for even more really cool art content. And if you'd like to support what I do, you can do it by buying me a coffee or 2. But if you'd like more bang for your buck, I highly recommend becoming a Patreon subscriber. You get access to all of these rewards as well as early ad-free access to all of my videos before anyone else sees it. There is my brush kit, there is speed paint, and there is also prints of my art delivered to your doorstep every few months. Seriously, it's a thing, it happens. I've had people tell me they've got like really high quality prints delivered. So yeah, support your girl. I'll leave a link in the cards and in the video description, and your support on there allows me to keep creating all this content for YouTube, so thank you for checking it out. And finally, are there any other artists you'd like to see a style study on in the future? First, check out my style study playlist. It should show up here in a few seconds in the outro. I've done so many of these, and chances are I've probably covered some of your faves on the series already. In case I haven't though, feel free to leave me a comment below or come tell me on my Discord server, link in the video description, and I'll be happy to add your artist to my ever-growing list. And that's pretty much it for this video, so thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I truly hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out some more style studies down here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!